So, welcome today, friends, to another cafe call. And today, I've invited Verdine Buchert to come and speak. She's an early Crest grad. In fact, she says it was the second cohort in Alberta that we had. And back then, we met out at Kananaskis, and we had some very interesting times out there. I have very warm memories of all those cohorts out there. It was terrific. Then she really engaged the process and has become a Crest board member. Well, maybe Verdine, for the sake of others who are going to be watching this video a little later, just tell us about your early Crest experiences briefly, and then we'll get into our conversation today.
Oh, thanks, Dan. Yeah, it was a real turning point in my life and in my career as well. I knew that I needed to get to whatever it was that I felt like I was being blocked from really doing what I was good at, but I didn't know what my sweet spot was. I felt like at 40, I was still trying to figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And so learning about Crest on the bus, shuttle bus on the way to church one morning, and Dan and Ann sat in front of us, and it turned out to be an excellent opportunity. Nobody had ever invited me to explore my strengths before, or my personality shape, and or my experiences, or to make sense of how all the things that had happened to me and figure out where is God taking me. And so then I also really appreciated all the tools in terms of thinking about working with teams and change management. And at that time, when we went through the masters and we talked about change management, a lot of people weren't talking about that. So I ended up right out of Crest being invited into some quality improvement work. It was a pilot project in Alberta in an acute care hospital in Calgary at Foothills. And it ended up being implemented across the province. And then I ended up in provincial quality improvement work in these brand new strategic clinical networks. Alberta Health Services was just a new provincial entity. And I had actually read books on change management, and I knew there was theory. And I was actually offering, oh, here, I read this one. Later, I'm seeing in bookshelves everywhere around. Anyway, we got to do some amazing projects to improve seniors' care, and everything I learned about working with teams, leading change, empowering people, collaborating with people, and even the way we went about it was very Crest shaped. So when we had workshops, it was like our Crest workshops. We were not just talking heads. We invited discussion. We invited perspectives. We learned from the frontline experts. And so, it just made it really rich.
Well, I remember those days vividly. It's so wonderful how the Lord has shaped you and helped you in your path as you've gone along. But the subject we want to talk about today is what happens when life takes an unexpected turn. That's when life and leadership gets really interesting. You have a plan, you've prayed about this, you have a vision, you have a way you want to go forward, and then something happens. And it's unexpected, not what you want, not what you prayed for, and it happens. So we want to talk about that today. In fact, here's a little bit of a diagram that gives us a bit of a visual on this. You really had a nice plan on that blue line, and then the red line happens. So Verdine has had to negotiate a number of those. And so when I was talking with her about some of the ideas for cafe and with our alumni, this one came up, and I thought that this would be very good. So Verdine's going to kind of give us a lead on this one here. Verdine, you just go right ahead and help us think about this. And then we're going to invite you who are on the call here to actually engage with some of your perceptions.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I guess I'm not surprised. I feel like I've had a lot of diversions from my intended path. But what I loved about a recent book that I read by Bruce Feiler called Life is in the Transitions is realizing that actually I'm not alone and I'm not that special. And everyone or tends to, or most people tend to expect life to be ascending and linear. And so then we're often surprised and disappointed when life goes off plan and it throws us. But then the question is that Filer really proposes, and is anyone really living in an ideal trajectory where everything goes as planned? And if you did, would that be a happy or an interesting life? Bruce Filer writes, conflict is the one precondition of a story. For there to be a narrative at all, something unforeseen must happen. The plot twist in Hollywood lingo. A story begins with some breach in the expected state of things. Something goes awry, and otherwise there's nothing to tell about. So these plot twists, it's really important to recognize they are what make our life stories so interesting and so soul-shaping versus a mere checklist of achievements.
Boy, isn't that true? I think that's so true. In fact, Verdine, I've noticed we have a bed and breakfast at our home, and we will often have people sit around the table and we'll tell stories. And they end up telling the stories of the unusual things that happened or crazy stuff that went on. And it really does make the conversation a lot more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A life that goes as planned it could be told in 3 minutes.
Yeah.
I was born in a great family. I knew what I wanted to be as soon as I was 6. I aced all my courses. I got the job of my dreams. I met my prince. I had a family. We lived happily ever after. Then I retired. The end.
No one goes to that movie.
No.
So that does help reframe these unexpected and often when they happen, that feels negative.
Mm-hmm.
It helps reframe that oh, this is actually where life gets interesting.
Yes. So if we go to the next slide, Dan, the book that Dan showed, it was written after interviews with hundreds of people, and then researchers going through thousands of pages of stories and identifying common themes. And one of the big things that emerged was that life tends to go off plan. And so the disruptors that you see, they could be planned, like marriage, that's a plan, or they could be unplanned, like divorce or death or domestic violence or addiction. And disruptors can impact any of these areas, that 5 areas that are listed there: relationships, identity, beliefs, work, and the physical health and function of our bodies. And so another interesting thing that Filer found was that the average adult experiences 30 to 40 disruptors.
Wow.
That's a lot of change.
Wow, that's a lot.
Now, on top of all those disruptors, life quakes can also happen. And life quakes could be in the same category, but they're much higher impact. So if you think about, for example, the death of an aging parent, dying of a terminal illness, that could be a disruptor. It's a huge loss. But it could be a much higher impact disruptor if it's accompanied by a rupture of family relationships and disagreements about how the inheritance is provided in the will, et cetera, or mistrust about the executors. So life quakes are much higher impact. They end up shaping or reshaping our lives, resulting in a fundamental shift in meaning or purpose or direction. And it's kind of like, even with your wavy disruptors, you're still kind of going upwards, and then you just hit a wall. And where you thought you were going, now it's kind of all reshaped, and you have to shift direction or purpose to figure out how to move on from there. The other thing about life quakes is that they also tend to come in clusters, like a multi-vehicle collision. So it's almost like when something chaotic is happening, it invites or allows us to be kind of vulnerable to other chaotic things. So one of my examples in my life is that within the space of about 2 years, I developed chronic fatigue after an Epstein-Barr infection. And the infection was so severe, I actually had liver failure, turned yellow, dropped a lot of weight, and then I was just exhausted. And then within that space of 2 years, we were also wiped out financially. And my husband started a new high stress job, and that really negatively impacted the dynamics of our family. And that was sustained for a lot of sustained stress. So like my experience, the average length of time to recover from a life quake is 5 years with a range of 1 to 11 years. So my chronic fatigue took 12 years to overcome. And so life quakes have a big impact on our lives, and they can be really tough to overcome. But like Bruce Feiler's title, there's a lot of interesting thing that happens in those transitions. And it's not like our life is paused or not happening. That's where a lot of the interesting learning or thinking or changes are being made as we attempt to grapple with these high impact events. But they can be very isolating. They can feel very isolating and unfair, and others seem to be flourishing and we're struggling.
Yeah, those do happen. In fact, listening to stories at Crest, when we do your life story, we hear this quite often. There will be a major life quake that can really just throw you because you did not anticipate it, you didn't want it, and it does affect your life. And I think one of the things we hear from folks is that by telling their story and listening to other stories, they come to the realization that they're not the only one who's had this happen. And that even that alone, knowing that you're not alone, that others have had things like this, or maybe even worse than yours, helps to reframe this, because we can feel like, we're the victim here, or God didn't answer my prayer, or why did God let this happen? And I think of my friends and how good they've got life, and I'm having a hard time. Boy, we can spiral in the wrong direction on this one. Mm-hmm. And that's where telling your story and hearing things like this today, Verdine, is very helpful to know that this is kind of the human experience, actually. Mm-hmm. Just kind of unique. Every story is unique, but the patterns are often common.
Yes, common in their not being common.
There you go. But common in that they happen.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Now, in addition to life disruptors, which are, as you can see from the list, they're bigger things, and then life quakes are enormous things. But then we also have these daily experiences. So all these things there's some things that are in our sphere of control, and some things in our sphere of influence, and then there's everything else. And so you're going along fine, and then all of a sudden somebody is hurt or emotionally distant, and now you need to navigate a conflict. And we've all come through the complications of a global pandemic and all the impacts to us politically and personally and financially in our relationships. And now we're also dealing with these world events and the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And so major things can intrude on our daily experience, our finances, and impact our time. And then sometimes it's just daily inconveniences, the weather. It's 3 feet of snow and you need to get somewhere, or your time gets taken up by something that becomes an obstacle in your well-planned day. So in all of these things, they all contribute to our life experience, but they also really affect our souls, how we're feeling.
Yeah, when you pile them all together, unless you have a good way to process them, they can be overwhelming. And I have noticed also when with people I've observed, when their life has got enough of the other more significant things, and maybe there's a life quake happening and they're at their max, and then just a small thing like spilling the milk at the table will they'll just shatter, and they just completely lose it. It's over spilling the milk. No, it's actually not spilling the milk. It's over the load that they were barely handling, and then the milk spilt, and you lose it.
Yeah, yeah.
So when you're in a conversation with someone or in a situation with someone, and a little thing happens, and there's an out of order response, that's way beyond whatever the current thing is, be sure that there's more going on in that person's life. Mm-hmm. And so don't jump on them for being so easily triggered by this, but be more curious. What else is happening? What are you carrying today? Mm-hmm. And it allows grace to come into this and to be inviting them to maybe share what else is actually happening.
And allow grace for ourselves if we're the ones crying over the spilled milk, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with all these things going on, if we can have the next slide, Dan, we realize how important it is to have wisdom. In the first chapter of James, we're invited to ask God for wisdom anytime we need it. And we need God's wisdom equally for daily inconveniences, major disruptors, and devastating life quakes, because as you just mentioned, Dan, a lot of times those happen all at once, or it's too much at once.
Yeah.
And yet every decision and interaction we have has weight and consequence. So there are no small decisions that we make. The smallest decisions and interactions, for example, how you interact day by day with your spouse or a child, or if someone else spills the milk, it adds up to weighty consequences, and that can impact the health of your relationships, or even the health of the souls of the people that are in your circle of influence. And so recognizing that our plot twists have a tendency to stir up intense emotions, and this can make it really difficult to trust God's goodness. We can become mired in frustration or blame or self-pity, and this is what author Dan Sullivan calls the gap. The gap is it's the space between what we expected or intended and what actually happened. And while we're mired in that emotional intensity, it can be difficult to remember to ask God for wisdom or to trust his goodness. In The Gap and the Gain book, Sullivan explains one of our greatest abilities as human beings is the ability to learn from our experiences. However, for many people, their lives are all experience and no learning.
Oh boy.
So, and then when you talk to people like that, you realize that there's a lot of woe is me, there's a lot of complaining, there's a lot of how is my life so terrible? And he says we can be blindsided by the intense emotions that some situations create. And we prefer to push these emotions aside until we feel better able to deal with them. However, the opportunity for greatest learning actually takes place when you feel that intensity. And so the gain part is when we're able to learn from the emotionally intense experiences. And so if you can do the next slide, there we go. The emotionally intense experiences, and we can actually learn while we're in them and think critically and receive wisdom from God. And so these verses from James also remind us that our mindset determines where there will be in a headspace where we're able to receive wisdom from God. So the challenge is, how do we untangle ourselves from these circles of obsessive thoughts and intense emotions so we can settle down and receive wisdom from God? And we're going to walk you through, or I'm going to walk you through a tool that's been really helpful for me from Dan Sullivan's book. And be thinking, because we want to have some discussion at the end of some of your strategies of how you shift yourself from the gap to the gain. So the next slide, Dan, is the experience transformer. And this is from Dan Sullivan's book. He's just developed a tool called the experience transformer to help us shift our brains from the gap to the gain. As we listen to ourselves and to God, we're able to transform our experiences into learning. And so working through these 5 questions combined with listening, prayer, and journaling can be equally useful for daily inconveniences or conflicts or major disruptors in life quakes. I really appreciated this framework for processing interactions with bosses and coworkers. As you can imagine, while I was in healthcare up until the end of March, through the pandemic, it did not bring out the best in people. We were under a lot of pressure. It was a pressure cooker. And when intense emotions are stirred up, we tend to focus on what didn't work in the experience, and we can get stuck there, or on what we wish we could have said or done if we'd seen it coming and been prepared. But if we look at the first question, there are always things that worked when we look for them. The second question shifts our energies into a future focus. What usefulness can we get from this experience to improve our future? When intense emotions are stirred up, we tend to focus on the past experiences. We're dragged back over and over, but there's actually useful learning that we can bring to the future. And so with the third question, we consider what we don't want going forward. It's a great awareness for empowerment around future planning, which is what the fourth question leads us to. Knowing what you know now, because you've had this experience, how will you approach your future differently? And finally, gratitude is such a positive way to conclude. And with a grateful mindset, rather than angry, self-pity, judgment, blamey mindset, we are in a much better headspace to receive wisdom from God and to have those crucial conversations with the people in our lives that will be collaborative and constructive and respectful, and that won't be like what Susan Scott calls the sugar-coated spitball. So the experience transformer here also works really well for looking back on major life quakes, where you're still kind of wondering how and why did that happen? And sometimes we get so stuck just thinking, oh, it's all about God trying to teach us something. But there could be so much more going on. So asking better questions is also a better way of listening to God. So one of my life quakes, as I just mentioned, when I was 38, I caught mono, I ended up with 12 years of chronic fatigue. But what worked about that experience was, first of all, it slowed me down. Before my illness, I really paid little attention to what I was thinking or feeling. My soul was just this neglected part of me that I actually didn't even know it existed. I was an achiever. I was bent on maximizing every minute. And after my illness, I had to slow down, and I also learned to listen to God, and that allowed much needed soul healing. What was useful about the experience was also slowing down to practice relating to people in authentic one-to-one relationships. It was shocking to me now when I look back and I think, well, I was doing teaching in large groups, and I'd have conversations with people where they'd come up and say, oh, we're so blessed by your class, but then we would have nothing else to say to each other. And now that I realize the richness of one-to-one relationships, that's what I prefer, is just talking to people soul to soul. Eventually, also, my healing became physical because I was learning to listen to God, and I could respond to his promptings to change my diet and add various nutritional supplements. What I learned from this experience about what I don't want is I don't want to accept a future of disease and disability. And that's what I've seen working in the health system is kind of the norm, is just disease management. And I've already tried being old. I didn't like it. At one point, I was so stiff, I could barely get my own socks on. And so much better now. And how I approach my future differently is to be very intentional and consistent with health habits, such as exercise and sleep and nutrition. And I am grateful for better physical energy and mental health in my 60s than I had in my 20s.
Wow. Through an experience you didn't want, God brought good out of that. Yeah. Well, I was just listening to your story, and we'll invite others of you a little later to maybe relate a story from, that this might evoke, these questions might evoke. I was thinking about, what has come along in my life that I didn't expect and didn't want. And the one that really comes to mind is that about 8 years ago, I came to Three Hills, and I was invited to be a pastor of a church here. at the same time doing Crest as part of what I was about. So Crest could be a quarter of my time. And then I would focus on the church. So we had brought in a new associate, and it went fine for a couple of years. And then, to my total surprise, it went south. And I've had many associate staff members, like up to 20 or more, and have had good relationships, good conversation, and a workable environment. And here came one that didn't work that way. It went completely the way I did not want it to go. I did not plan it to go. And it was a disruptor. It disrupted everybody, including the church. And so my nice 10-year plan that I had laid out in a nice linear line, like that, suddenly changed. And it came to an end. And what it did was it made me realize I had a major choice. I figured I have 10 years of good life and ministry I could offer. Where would I want to do this? Do I want to do it in a situation where there's a lot of conflict? It would take like 5 years to kind of work it all out and help it? Or would I like to put those 5 years in building something positive like the Crest program? And what it did to me is it made me journal more than ever. And boy, praying and saying, Lord, what are you showing here? What are you doing? Had some dramatic dreams, which I had taken a little bit of reading and research about how do you interpret dreams, because the Bible is full of dreams. God speaks through dreams, not all dreams, but he speaks through some dreams. And I wrote in my journal some of the interpretations of these dreams, like, oh my goodness, they were so clear. So what I learned was a whole new level of conversation with Jesus, with God, my Father, and being led. And it has resulted in a richer and better, just a richer relationship with God. And some grace to know that, even if you do your leadership things right, it doesn't mean it's going to work out the way you thought. And that's part of life as well. And that you have to have the grace to be able to go with that. And I find that I am now in a place that I feel even more joy doing now Crest full time. In fact, if that had not happened, we would not be on this cafe call, because I wouldn't have had time for this. We would not be doing monthly webinars and helping you in really practical ways. There's a lot of things that would not have happened if I had remained on my nice 10-year plan. And I have come to really trust the Lord that when a disruptor comes, he's still got good somewhere. In fact, it might be better given the new circumstances. Mm-hmm. And so that does help reframe and rethink how we parse out and get meaning from these experiences.
Yeah, Dan, your story is a perfect illustration and segue into the next slide, where there's a quote from Dallas Willard from The Divine Conspiracy that says, your life is not something from which you can stand aside and consider what it would have been had you had a different one. What if you had made a different decision for a different associate? Or what if your associate hadn't made some of the decisions that he made? No, he says there is no you apart from your actual life. You are not separate from your life, and in that life, you must find the goodness of God. Otherwise, you will not believe that he has done well by you, and you will not truly be at peace with him.
Yep.
So hearing you conclude about how convinced you are of the goodness of God, but we also journey with you in the intensity of that. It was grueling.
Yeah.
It was really tough on you and emotionally, and there was so much conflict that you were just immersed in.
Yep.
So getting to this point of finding the goodness of God in that circumstance, that's amazing. And this is, of course, really also necessary for us to be at peace with God in order to receive his wisdom, because as James tells us, if we don't expect him to respond, we shouldn't expect to receive anything from him. So it's a very important process to go through to be able to be at peace with the things that God has allowed in our lives, but also to do that in a way that's authentic appreciation for the benefits and all the good things that God has brought, either by drawing us closer to himself, shifting our directions, or bringing new opportunities to us. So this is where we really want to hear from the group. And we've got the final slide there, Dan, that just to prompt you. And if you want us to go back to the experience transformer while you're talking, we could do that too. But just to, you've also been doing some journeying, and you've worked through your stories with Crest in the certificate as well as the master's. So what kind of strategies have you used to shift from that sense of disempowerment and disappointment to be really being proactive, or to support your own growth in emotionally intense situations, or to leverage the kind of obstacles that you've come up against into opportunities? And this is where we would love to hear from you and learn from you.
Well, let's put it back to those questions, because that's kind of helpful to just spur some storytelling. So what comes to mind as you've been listening? Because I'm actually pretty sure all of you are thinking about something. We're hoping that you can share something that might show these questions helping you reframe what happened. So who's the first brave person?
I guess it could be me, not because I'm brave, but
okay.
I entered Crest, I think it was 2011, the London cohort. And I was in crisis. And I think a lot of people in Crest aren't in crisis. They're just stuck, maybe spinning a bit, whatever. But for me, I was in crisis. And our church had fallen apart. I was on the leadership team, and everything was broken. And I realized in that time period that I wasn't my normal self. Like suddenly I didn't have energy left. I was exhausted. There was nothing normal the way I considered myself to be, my old self. There was nothing left at that point. And so in my experience, the Crest really helped. But for me, I needed time to process it. Everyone needs time, I think, but I think probably I needed more time to really get to the point of what have I learned, to separate myself and to stop asking those questions. What if this wouldn't have happened? Like you said, Dallas Willard, you can't be separate from who you are. That took me a long time. And so I think I can, at this point, see a new future, right? But it took me a long time to see a new future, because the path was way off what I had planned, way off. And so I don't think I can fully answer this question, but that's my story.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things you did, Eddie, was you reached out for help. And I think that's an important thing, is that when you hit a life quake or one of these big disruptors, don't try to just do it all on your own, because it's very difficult to get perspective when you're by yourself trying to do your own internal thinking on these matters. So you signed up for Crest and found a place and a process to be able to think this through and have some space to think it through, and maybe some tools to help you think it through. So when I hit my quake, I thought, well, who can I talk to? And there was a man in the church that was a professor at the college and knew this church for a long time. And I went and I was completely transparent with this guy. And he really helped a lot. And then I also was pretty open with the Crest board, what I was going through. So Verdine being on the board, journeyed with me on this. And then the Lord brought along some really helpful spiritual insights through a new group, opentableconference.com, that we had not heard of before, and really got a lot of help spiritually and emotionally there. So there may have been, like maybe others of you, what are some resources? Verdine mentioned this book, Life is in the Transitions. So maybe there's another resource that you found helpful, Gap and Gain, or what strategies? How did you work through your quake?
I don't really have any resources per se that I would point to at this point, but when we went through a kind of a crisis that eventually led to us being in no man's land right now, I think reaching out to other people was really important. And so I'm glad you brought that up, Dan. Another piece is just really resting in God's promises. And that's what we're doing right now. We're kind of in a situation where it's like, okay, don't see the path forward. It's kind of hazy and stuff like that in our current situation. And so, this was a really apt topic for us right now. But I think what we're needing to do right now is just really arm ourselves with God's goodness. I really appreciate those questions because they do keep things on that positive side, right? It's how can I take these circumstances and find the positive and remain positive even when it's difficult. So for us, we're in a transition right now and I don't see the future. So that's why I'm here. And so it's good to be reminded to just stay on that positive side and arming ourselves with his promises. And so that's what we're up to.
Yeah, Micah, it's interesting too. There's so much richness in the resources that we've offered. And one of the things that I really appreciated from Life is in the Transitions is that he also noted that a lot of people, when they're in the midst of that period of uncertainty and they have experienced a life quake, as I have, because my contract ended the end of March. I really enjoyed what I was doing and I thought I'd found my lifetime calling and I just was planning to be there for a long time already. And all of a sudden I'm out and I'm like, what? So was helpful in the book. He talks about how people shift. So he talks about the ABCs. So where we put our focus and our energy, A was on agency. So that's on how am I taking care of myself? And I actually forgot about that part for a while. Well, it was so much pressure and so many deadlines and so much chaos and dysfunction. So I got back to the A of really taking care of myself. B is belonging. So it's just going deeper in our relationships, the ones that provide us with real resilience. And so I remarried almost a year ago and we now have 6 kids, or before I had 2, and then my daughter's husband, so 3, I guess. So it's investing in those close family relationships and then an extended family. And so that belonging part is so important, self-care and belonging as for part of our recovery, for rebuilding, for getting ready for what's next. And a lot of people just ease off of call when they're in a transition and just take a break. And that's what I've had to do as well. And just, I really trusted. Ephesians tells us that God has plans for us and he has a lot of work to get done. So knowing that if I got myself physically, mentally, spiritually, my soul into a place where I had capacity again, that God would take care of the what's next. And so there was a lot of resting in that while I focused on those fundamentals. And 6 months later, I'm feeling a lot better.
And Verdine, maybe you could tell a recent story of going for lunch and how God is using you now in the midst of your pause.
Yeah, I know. I as I said, I love one-to-one soul-to-soul conversations. And I had a team and we had amazing relationships. And I've been asking God recently, well, how do I actually connect with people? Because now I don't have that work environment or things like that. And really interesting random things have been happening quite consistently. And so a couple of weeks ago, we were empty fridge, getting ready to go to Victoria. I'm hungry. And so I decide I'm going to take myself out for lunch at this little bakery cafe in our neighborhood. They got outdoor tables, great food. And I sat down at a table, and I've actually never done that before. So it was a little bit different for me. And within a few minutes, the woman with a new baby across at the table across from me has started up a conversation with, so where are your ancestors from? And my ancestors are originally from Malaysia and Zaporizhia region. They were Mennonites. And she was from, she grew up in Russia until she was 19. She's a Christian. She's attending an Orthodox church where 80% are Ukrainian. Her husband is Ukrainian, speaks Russian, from Odessa. And she was there at the cafe just seeking God and asking, why are you allowing this evil? It didn't make any sense to her because the Russians, Ukrainians, they're brothers. They're all Slavic. And so she was there reading her Bible and really seeking God on the question. And so before long, we're sitting at the same table and having a discussion about how God is not the only cause in the universe. And because he grants us free will, he doesn't automatically just stomp on our choices when we are making bad choices. And that leaves a lot of room for chaos when you have a psychopathic autocrat, dictator. But we also talked about how God brings good out of evil. And because I've been involved with Heart Ministry and on their mailing list, and they are actively working in Ukraine through the churches there, I was able to share some of the background and the good work and where God is working. And then I said, just a minute, I actually think I have an email from Heart that just came today that I haven't read. So I read her this email from Heart about what's happening in the churches in Ukraine and how they're full and how people are finding their purpose serving the refugees, but how they also need the refugees and how this has invigorated the church. And I read this to her and she's, wiping tears. And that email had literally just been sent an hour or so before our conversation. So then I also contacted Lloyd Snako, who is the founder of Heart, and said, this is what happened to me. And so he was encouraged. So yeah, very, very, very interesting things can happen, even when we feel like we don't have any structure around us. God is still prompting and guiding us.
Yep. You have time to do things you couldn't do before. And so by opening up your heart and life to God, saying, what would you like me to do today? Mm-hmm. You can get in on an amazing adventure. Mm-hmm. Well, how about someone else? Let's have time for one more. Is there one more story of disruption and how you worked through it or are working through it? And how do you handle this?
Well, for me, at the partway through Crest, God was so good to send me to Crest because he knew my life was about to fall apart. And personally, there were a lot of stresses. At work, there were a lot of stresses, and it ended up with me burning out with adrenal fatigue, and I needed 4 months off. And then I really sensed God calling me away from what I was doing, an ED at a pregnancy care center, and moving on to something else. But for me, I think what I learned was to just sit in the neutral zone and to not rush it and allow God to do the work. And Kathy Ostapchuk, who was one of our instructors, had said to me that the neutral zone will give you a lot if you let it. And so just staying there was really helpful to me. And now I find when there's disruptions, like my mother-in-law passed away very unexpectedly in the end of August, and she was living with us, and other things that have come along lately, like a bunch of things, they all come at once. I don't have that sense of wanting to get back to normal. And if this can just be done, when the grieving's done, when this is done, when that is fixed, when that is sorted out, finally at 59 years of age, I have figured out that there is no when this. Life is always going to be messy and curly. And I feel like that situation I went through 8 years ago, has really empowered me to, when life gets messy and unsettled again, to just rest in it and not wish my life away, because I have today. And if I can't wait for this to be fixed, I'm missing today. And then let's face it, when this is fixed, there's going to be something else. So,
Yep. Good words. Good point. So let me mention what's coming up in our next webinar and deep dive. Later this month, October 27, there will be a webinar about how we empower other people. John Pritchard is another Crest graduate who is now our lead facilitator. And he has noted that especially after COVID, many people feel disempowered and lost and not sure and reticent to really step out anymore. And his challenge is, as Christian leaders, a good responsibility is to help people get up now, help people get going again. How do you empower people so that they can actually step into life again? He's got some very good presentation that he'll make in the webinar, and then also the deep dive is really good. And he's just putting it all together right now. So this might be something that you invite some other people in your network who are responsible for people. How do you actually, in a simple and easy way, like even within 60 seconds, you can start to empower somebody. And sometimes a little action by a leader has a wave-like influence in somebody's life. You may want to learn about this one. So we'll let you know in an email coming out, of course. And then the next month, November, is when I'll be on deck. And I'm going to talk about critical thinking. Man, we thought we were all critical thinkers. And then COVID hit, and you realize from the extreme reactions, no, most people are not critical thinkers. They're emotional reactors. And we as leaders need to make sure we're not just being emotional reactors. We actually think critically. But when you are in a conflict or when you're in stress, because the emotions are in there and there's other people acting out, it takes some real self-control and some discipline to remain a critical thinker. Well, that'll be an interesting conversation. So that's our fall lineup here. Looking forward to it very much. So good to have you on the call today, everybody. Thank you for contributing. Really helpful on this conversation.
Awesome. Really great to have you on the call today.